Hello, everybody. I just wanted to put a trigger warning on today's episode. We will be talking about sexual abuse, sexual violence. And for those of you who have been affected by it, I wanted to put this warning on there so you could decide whether or not it's appropriate for you to listen. So consider this the trigger warning, and we'll proceed with today's episode.
When you're fed up with fighting food and your body, join us here. I'm Ali Shapiro, creator of the Truce with Food program and your host for Insatiable, where we explore the hidden aspects of fighting our food, our weight, and our bodies, and dive deep into nutrition science and true whole health. Fair warning, this is not your parents' health care. This is a big rebel yell to those who crave meaning, hunger for truth, and whose lust for life is truly insatiable. Believe me, freedom awaits. Welcome, everybody, to Season 6 of Insatiable. Our season theme is radical healing and what's possible when we get to the cause of what ails us. As I've been saying in other episodes, we're using activist Angela Davis's definition of radical to pull things out at the root. And when we can do that, we can heal. And we heal when we're in choice, not when everything goes our way. So we're going to explore how to get to the root of our stories and what radical healing changes in our lives. Before we get to today's guest, who has been on my bucket list to get her butt on the Insatiable podcast, I first want to invite you all to my 2019 Truce with Food program. This program runs once a year, and it's a personalized online coaching experience to create lasting food freedom. We focus on rewriting your story so that you can be the author of it, because your story is what causes you to fall on and off track with your eating. So we're just going to transform it. This program is only open once a year, so I hope you join me come January. When registration opens, you can join the waitlist at alishapiro.com/trucewithfood 2019. Okay, so on to today's episode. Radical healing comes in many forms on many different journeys. One such path of healing is to advocate and support the healing of others. In today's episode, Radical Healing, Transform Trauma into Purpose, I invited Tashmica Torok to share her inspirational story of transforming her personal trauma into activism and advocacy to end child sexual abuse and support the healing of children and families. Tashmica will explore the root of healing challenges for sexual abuse survivors, how creating the Firecracker Foundation supported in facilitating her healing journey, and how resilience can have a shadow side. For example, wearing ourselves out, and how relearning self-care again and again takes us into deeper levels of healing. Before we get to question Tashmica, I want to tell you a little bit more about her. She is a nationally recognized survivor activist working to end child sex abuse. She is a powerhouse fundraiser and movement maker who has raised thousands of dollars and countless volunteer hours in support of her work. As the executive director of the Firecracker Foundation, she incites riots of generosity and advocates for the healing of children and families every day. The growth of this innovative organization has inspired a move into a larger space where all programs, mental health therapy, trauma-sensitive yoga, caretaker support groups, and crisis intervention will be hosted under the same roof. Tashmica is also a published storyteller, kitchen witch, and a nearly retired roller derby skater. She's also the mother of 3 boys, wife to a talented tile installer, and a behind-the-scenes volunteer. Thank you so much for being here today, Tashmica.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm so excited to be something checked off on your bucket list.
You are. You were on the Transitioning to Wellness Career podcast, and I was like, I've admired your work forever, and I was like, I need to talk to her more because she has done the work to heal, and I think you show us at our best when we rewrite our story. We can basically take the pain and turn it into something really useful. So thanks for being here and being you. And having a good story to tell.
Yeah, I have lots of stories to tell.
Well, let's start with that. Tell us a little bit about your story, how you ended up, I guess, here today through the lens of being sexually abused as a child yourself.
Well, I am a survivor of child sexual abuse. My father was my perpetrator between the ages of 6 and 8. I often just simply say that I'm a survivor, but what really happened to me is I was serially raped during that time period, and I actually don't remember when the abuse started. I only know that my father passed away, and that's when it ended. So that's a really stark way to tell a story, but sometimes I feel like our language doesn't really, when we say sexual assault, it doesn't really give us the full picture of what's actually happening to children in the world. It can be a generalization, and people can take that and imagine all sorts of things around what that means. And so I just want to be clear that that's what happened to me for the sake of myself and for the sake of anybody who's listening, so that, there's a sense of solidarity when we tell our full stories in this world. So after he passed away, I spent about a year reflecting on what it would mean to tell what had happened to me, and really just being very fearful, being really scared that my father, whose reputation was really one that was respected when he passed away, was really on my shoulders. I had this story. I felt at the time that I was the only one who knew my father in the way that I did as an abuser. And I just wasn't, I was really scared about what that would mean to tell my family that he wasn't the person that they thought he was, that he was someone who hurt me for several years and changed the way I thought about myself, my body. Of course, I wasn't aware of all this when I was, 8 or 9 years old, but I think now about all the ways that he changed the way that I thought about myself, my body, my religion, my spirituality, and my relationship to other people. And so I disclosed about a year after he passed away. I shared with my mom that he had been abusing me. And I think the words that I used when I told her, as I just said, that actually, no, what happened is I had a teacher who brought in an educator to talk to us about what abuse is. And he asked me to raise my hand. And everybody put your head down. And if you've experienced this kind of abuse, raise your hand. And I was like, listen, fool, ain't nobody doing that. Like, everybody knows that someone is looking during an altar call. Like, I'm not doing that. So I waited for him to leave, and then I told my teacher. And so my teacher helped me tell my mother, and I told my teacher that my father, I think I said that my dad hurt me. And she said to me, I believe you. It happened to me, and it's going to be okay. And I still, at 38 years old, believe that those words were transformational for me and really set the stage for me to see the way that I had been hurt in a way that was not about isolation, but was about community. So I told my mother believed me right away. And after that, it became a series, became my life of healing, really. It started pretty much from there. I didn't see a traditional therapist until I was probably 30, but I was believed right away, and I never felt like I had to hide what happened to me, which I think is really important about the way that I grew up. I was never blamed. It was never a secret. It was never something that I was chastised for if I brought it up. It was actually the opposite. It wasn't something that was celebrated, for sure, but it was something where I could talk about it. I had the freedom to talk about it based on my capacity. And so no one ever forced me to talk about it either. So, down the road, I, at 30 years old, went to therapy for something completely unrelated. And I kind of mentioned to my therapist that I had this experience, kind of like I told her that I fell off my bike. I really didn't say it in a way that was like this sense of gravity. I was just like, oh yeah, and when I was a kid, my dad molested me, and then on to the next topic, right? And I remember she was like, maybe we talk about that a little more. And it's just how I had compartmentalized it as something that happened. It wasn't something that I needed to deal with. And I didn't have the understanding of how it was impacting or how it could have been impacting other areas of my life. And so she pulled out a book during one of our sessions. And for the first time in my life, she showed me what the definition of sexual abuse could be. What could happen? What are all the things that could be included in a child's experience of sexual abuse? And then on the next page, and both of these were kind of like in a little, graphic form. And on the next page was, what are the consequences of what she called several times untreated child sexual trauma, which is what I had, what my experience was. And for the first time, I first of all knew that what had happened to me was very severe. I didn't have that lens before. I thought that my idea of sexual assault or sexual violence was really rooted in Lifetime movies, which I think is really interesting because it tells you how old I am. That I would sit with my mother and watch all these Lifetime movies. But in honesty, I thought survivors were people who someone jumped out of the bush, a stranger probably. Sometimes it was a guy you knew, raped you, maybe beat you up. And then there's like a TV montage that we were all, if you were like me and watched these movies growing up, that we're all very used to, right? Like there's a scene where she cries in the shower, and I'm not minimizing that this could be a very real experience, but there's definitely a kind of a way that sexual violence is portrayed in movies and TV. And there's definitely a certain kind of survivor who is centered. And it's usually a white woman, sometimes a college person, whether they're an athlete or academic, but they're usually a college co-ed of some sort. They go to court, they call the police, they go through that process. And then in some way, justice is handed out, whether they get justice or they don't get justice in the or like in the frame of what they wanted is negotiable. And then at the end, there's some uplifting thing comes from it. And so for me, that's what a survivor looked like. A survivor isn't, until I saw like The Color Purple, or until I saw Lady Sings the Blues about Billie Holiday, or Women of Brewster Place. So until I saw these movies based on books written by Black women, I didn't really know that the majority of survivors are actually experiencing things like I experienced. And so it was really the first time that I was like, oh, so child sexual abuse is severe or can be severe, does have a long-term effect on our life, which I learned also that the consequences, right? Like some of the consequences that I was dealing with in my life could have been, and in that moment I didn't know for sure, but could have been tied to the fact that I had experienced this trauma. And so I went home and I started Googling what happens to people who experience untreated sexual trauma. And I found all these statistics, on Rape, Assault, Incest National Network. And it was all these statistics about, people who are more likely to have addictions or have disordered eating or practice self-harm or be incarcerated before they turn 18. And to be honest, I used to look at it, and when I first started looking at it, I was in so much pain, like going through this kind of therapeutic process, that I was like, okay, but you know what? This is really hard and it sucks, but I don't have an addiction. And so for me, it was like, okay, like we're going to get through this. This time period felt like rolling on a cheese grater, but at least at minimum, I didn't have an eating disorder. I certainly had some disordered eating, which I'm sure that we'll talk about a little bit, but never to the extent of having an eating disorder. And so that's what I did at first. And then I realized that there are all these people, there are all these humans that are out here in the world who have experienced sexual abuse, that are living this experience, are having all of these negative impacts on their lives. And I just started wondering, like, why don't we get this information? Like, why didn't someone between the ages of 9 and 18, when I was a kid, tell me that this was a lifelong situation, that trauma could impact me my whole life? And would that information have changed the way that I healed, and that I thought about myself, and that I thought about what my future could look like? And so all of that turned into me creating the Firecracker Foundation, which is really my effort to make sure that families understand sexual trauma as a long-term situation, and that the impacts can manifest developmentally for children. So the way that children look at trauma when it happens versus when they're 10 or 11 or 12 or 13 or 15 or 16 look different, or when they start dating, or when they, get a job and have people who are not family members in charge of them, or, there's all these things that happen in our lives that really do impact the way we view ourselves and the way that our trauma kind of shows up in our life. And so here we are now, 5 years later, and that's what I'm doing today.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing.
That was a lot. So if anybody tuned out, that's a long
No,
story, but that was my whole story.
you said so many things that I want to circle back. Like, first of all, I love that your point about we have to name what it is, right? And
Yeah.
not sugarcoat it or like say sexual abuse like it was rape, right? And those are hard words to say, but if we don't name it, we can't really address it.
Yeah. No, and I actually sometimes talk about like an undiagnosed disease, because honestly, complex PTSD, when you're 30 and you find out you have complex PTSD, that is an undiagnosed condition that I had been living with since I was probably 9 or earlier, if we're really being honest. And I had no idea because no one told me. And to be fair, I also say that, this was 1988, 89. It was the age pre-Oprah, like Oprah was just stepping onto the scene. So I really do mark time with like when kind of Oprah and talk shows started really talking about these things in a thoughtful way, like in a way where we were really kind of digging into these questions. And this was before then. And I lived in a fairly, at the time, we were a pretty religious household. And so I think in some ways they did not in some ways, I really feel my mother, after my father had passed away, really did the best that she could. And she created all of this space for me to talk about these things. But really, we just didn't have the information about how this trauma could show up in our lives or show up in my life. And I can't say our life too, because this trauma shows up in my mother's life. It impacts my siblings. And I think that we at that time and even now, we don't really talk about kind of the tentacles of like what sexual trauma and sexual violence looks like in our families and in our communities.
Yeah. And I agree with you that, okay, at that time we didn't talk about it. And if people like you don't start stepping forward and naming it, we will continue not to talk about it, right? There's a reason that it's not talked about.
Yeah. And also I think it's more about, we don't have the capacity at this point to create safe environments for people to come forward. And I think for me, that's more what it's about. I think for me, my father was dead. Most people who are survivors of child sexual abuse don't have the luck of having their perpetrator drop dead on them. Like that's a very unique privilege that I recognize, that like I can be here telling my story all day, every day, and I don't have to fear any retribution. I don't have to fear its impacts on a legal case. A lot of survivors can't tell their story in full because their story is in some sort of legal proceeding or has been. And if their story changes ever so slightly, that could impact their, legal situation. And so I think in some ways, the way that our system has been created to hold perpetrators accountable also really silences survivors, because not every survivor wants their perpetrator to go to jail either. So there are many survivors who will wait until the statute of limitations has been passed before they start speaking. And so there's lots of little nuances around like why people speak up and why they don't. But I really believe a lot of it has to do with, we, first of all, don't believe people anyway when they first come forward. And we don't really create environments that really encourage people to come forward just as a community practice.
Oh my God. I mean, if 2018 taught us anything, right, between Michigan State, which you worked with some of Dr. Larry Nassar's victims, didn't you? Because you're in Michigan. Am I correct?
We are in Michigan, and we have been, we're basically in this area, but I can't really talk about like who our clients are and things like that.
Yeah. No, that's, again, I don't want you to breach any confidentiality, but
yes, we are in the community where, Larry Nassar lived and perpetrated on over 250 people.
Yeah. And then we just last month had the Kavanaugh hearings where the, Dr. Christine Blasey Ford, who, Dr. Anita Hill, who, by the way, everyone has a doctorate from Yale, but the media doesn't say Dr. Anita Hill because the media is what it is. But Dr. Anita Hill had set a precedent, and we thought we would have made some progress. And then you saw what happened. And again, it's not just because the verdict didn't go her way. I mean, we know tons of women started running for office and everything. But then we saw Dr. Christine Blasey Ford testify and was not believed, clearly. Or the version was, oh, we believe you, but you don't remember properly, which is, we don't believe you, right? I mean,
right. Semantics, for sure.
Yeah. So I think your point about we don't create the conditions for people to even come forward. And as you're talking too, I'm also thinking about how we define justice in this culture, right? Is it who gets to decide? To your point about some survivors don't want their abuser to go to jail or whatnot. So what role do you think justice plays in the healing of how people who have been sexually abused move forward?
I think it's very individual. And I also think that justice is like a small piece because, first of all, justice is like the word love or like the word forgiveness. It means something different to all of us. And I don't care if you're using a biblical definition or if you're using Webster's definition. We do not love each other the same. We do not, we don't forgive each other the same, and we don't seek justice the same way. We all do those things very differently, and there's a lot of nuance in the ways that we want those things. So I think for some people, justice can look like you call the police, the person who harmed you is arrested, they go to court, and they go to jail. And for some people, that will be what they want, and that'll be the end of it. For other people, justice can look like accountability. For someone who harmed you to say, yes, I did that thing. Here is why I did that thing, or what my thinking was and why I thought that way. And I am sorry. And here are the things that I will do to make sure that I never do that to you or anyone else again. And that doesn't necessarily need to involve the justice system, or it can. Like both of those things can happen at the same time or before or after these things happen. And so I think it just really depends. I know that there's also situations where if we're justice in the way that we think about it in this country with the criminal justice system, there are people who are undocumented who are being assaulted that will never come forward, or because their family members are undocumented. So if they come forward, there's a chance that their intermingling with the state could impact their family members' ability to stay in this country, and they're not going to risk that. Or the person who harmed them is undocumented. And even though they don't want to be hurt anymore, they also don't necessarily want to see that person be sent out of the country to a place where they might be harmed. Because one thing that is true for most children is they're trying to avoid violence and hurt for everyone else in the way that they manage their abuse. So we always have to think about like how when we tell people what may happen next, or what, when people have an understanding of what might happen next, and what might happen next is violence or is going to cause some kind of harm or fracture to the family, then that also doesn't create an environment for children that welcomes them coming forward. I'm always wondering, I wonder what would happen if we had a system of healing for people who do harm, and we told children that their person who is hurting them would go get healed. How would that land? I think about myself, if I had thought that my dad, because what he would tell me is that if I told mom would hate him and the whole family would be broken up and everything would be ruined and it would be my fault. And so I just think about what if someone had told me that that wasn't true and that my dad would actually go get help so he wouldn't hurt me anymore? How would that feel differently to me than my family being split up? And what would I have been more likely to come forward? And I think probably, because that just feels different.
Yeah. And that's so radical to say, wait, let's look at the abusers themselves in addition to the victims, right? And what would it take for them to be healed? I mean, that's you probably know the Bible better than I do, but that seems like a biblical, judge the sin, not the sinner type of hardcore forgiveness and empathy and compassion.
Well, I don't even know that. So when I'm thinking about justice too, I'm thinking about restorative justice and I'm thinking about transformative justice. And so restorative justice is just focused on the harm done. It's you hurt me. I don't want you to do that anymore. Here's what I need to repair the harm. And transformative justice looks more at the overall like, what are the causes and conditions, like, in the world that contributed to this being a problem? And so I feel like it can include forgiveness, it can include empathy and compassion, or it doesn't have to. It really depends on what the survivor wants and needs from this situation, or to repair the harm that's been done. And so I'm very new in my understanding of both of those things. And I'm sure someone will correct me or post like the real definition. But
no, they won't.
when I think about like how we respond, I think what I'm really saying is I am 38 years old. So I have been a survivor for, let's just say, 32 years. And I'm exhausted of the burden of fixing sexual violence being placed on the shoulders of the people who have been harmed. When they specifically, when we create environments where it is not safe for them to come forward. If we don't start approaching sexual violence as a problem that stems from the people who are doing the harm, then we will never resolve it. Because by the time clients come to me, it's happened. It's already happened. And I want to focus on their healing. And I want to be able to be supportive of their healing. But there's this whole other thing that's happening out in the world that is more about like people hurting the people who are coming to me. And I would love to see us as a culture, as a community in the United States and globally really looking at like why are perpetrators here? Why is this harm being perpetuated? Why does it keep happening? And why don't we have like a system to fix that? Why don't we have a system in place that addresses what is a national crisis, that does not stem or focus on survivors as the solution? Like survivors are survivors because someone hurt us. At that point, we can't do it. Like, there's nothing survivors can do to prevent sexual violence, right? Like, we can't do anything about it. It's already happened. So I just don't understand why we're not looking at what can we do nationally to end sexual violence from the perspective of stopping people from doing it. Like, what do we need to do? And I just don't see that nationally. And that's really what I want to see.
I love that, because I didn't realize that even in that question, I'm putting the burden on the survivor, like not unintentionally, right? But that's what we do, is we put the burden on the survivor to figure it out by coming forward or whatnot. But yeah, what are the causes and conditions? I love root cause resolution. What have you discovered so in your 5 years of the Firecracker Foundation, and of course your own therapy and experience?
Well, I mean, I've discovered so many things. I've learned so much in the past 5 years. And a lot of it is what you already know. It's rape culture. It's toxic masculinity. It's white supremacy. It is rooted in our ancestral traumas. We know that rape has been used to torture Native people, African American people, Black people, the enslaved people. We know that rape has been used as a war crime across the globe. Like, we know that rape is a tool that has been used against women. And so if we know that is a tool that has been used because of all of those things, right? Because of white supremacy, because of toxic masculinity, and then we have a lens, like we actually have the answer. We know what the problem is, so then we can start working to remove those things as we are raising the next generation of human beings. We know that we can remove whiteness as like the goal of human beings, right? As what is right in this world. We know that we can start talking about toxic masculinity and dismantling it for the next generation. Like, these are actual things that we can do through so many different systems across the country if we're proactive about thinking about those things and how those things lead men in particular from believing that women's bodies are theirs, or that it's a tool to punish or torture trans people, right? Or it's a tool to separate communities or to show someone that they don't have any value. There was a report that just came out that there have been over 500 law enforcement officers that have been accused of sexual assault. and it's not a report that we hear very often, because obviously power and privilege, but we also have to think about how rape is showing up in our institution, because people who are in mental health facilities, people who are incarcerated are being sexually assaulted. And we don't often talk about those things, that it's not the boogeyman, it's a show of power, and it is a tool that has been used to make sure that people who do not have value feel that worthlessness since the beginning of time.
I'm so glad you named that, because we're swimming in it, right? Like fish in this water. And until we can name it and realize, oh my God, these are the roots of it, we're just going to keep kind of trying to, not going to solve the problem, right? We're just going to continue with more abuse. I feel like it's still going to be the assembly line of trying to fix things rather than, go upstream and find the root causes. And I'm glad that you said, because again, this is kind of new territory for me. I'm not super familiar with sexual trauma or whatnot, but I have read that it is about power. It's not about sex. It's about power. And can you define power for people so they understand? Because I think there's all different definitions, to your point of we all define things differently.
Yeah, I don't even know how I would define power. And I think sometimes it's about power, but sometimes it is also about sex.
Okay, so it's both. Yeah, correct me, please.
Yeah, no. And it's not necessarily even, I think it can be about both things. We have heard so much about incels that are trying to show they're obviously trying to take power back, but it's also about sex, right? That women are taking sex away from them in some way, some really unreasonable thinking. And again, trying to take ownership over a body that is not their own.
If you're in a culture that defines sex as power and that you're entitled to it, right? It's like, oh, then you're giving sex that meaning rather than, it could be something beautiful, but you're using it in that context, in toxic masculinity cultures.
Right. And, when I think about my boys, I have 3 sons, and I think about what it means to teach children that love, that sex, really that there's nothing in this world of value that can be taken, right? Like there's nothing that you can't take love, you can't take sex and have it be the same thing as a consensual relationship. You can't demand forgiveness. You cannot force people to be accountable for their behavior. And I think it's really important to draw those distinctions, especially for young men, because we live in a culture where it's like, if you want it, take it, go get it. Like you can just go get it. Well, you can't. You can't just go get anything. You can work towards things and earn things. You can ask for things and someone can give you something, but you can't take something and have it have that same value as something that you have earned or someone has given you or something that is consensual. And I think that's a really important distinction that we don't, again, culturally, we are taught that we can just go out and get it. Right. And I think that we have to start talking about, when we're unpacking all of these things, whether it's toxic masculinity or white supremacy or homophobia or transphobia or any of these things, like we can't force people to do things that we want them to do with their bodies. Like we can try, but it will just be pain and torture. And no one will be living in their wholeness, which is what we should be wanting from the world.
That is such a beautiful point. Like I just wrote that down, like nothing of value can be taken. Like you have to cultivate the magic and the beauty of what you want rather than really taking it. That's such a great point. So I love your point about, like, you basically said it does come down to power, and I define power as like choices, like who has choices, who doesn't. But the body, you just kind of ended there on the body. I want to talk about what you've learned is necessary for the body. Because in your story, it kind of sounded like, okay, this thing happened to me. I kind of compartmentalized it and put it away. But the body remembers, right? And I think is it Vander Kolk, his book, The Body Keeps the Score. And I think that's such a great title. What have you learned and implemented in the Firecracker Foundation is so important for the body and the nervous system, the memory within the body?
Well, I think there's so much about the body that we're still learning about and still understanding. And I think the first thing that I would say is that at the Firecracker Foundation, we often say, and we are a survivor-led survivor-focused organization. And I think the way that we talk about our bodies and the way that we talk about healing our bodies also follows that model. So we practice yoga with our youth, and the yoga that we practice is a consent-based practice where we offer postures and we offer options, but no one is forced to do anything in the yoga sessions. So I like to tell the story of having youth or children who come into yoga class and like lay down and roll up in a blanket or a yoga mat like a little burrito, and that's their yoga practice for the day. And we'll have people who will be confused by that, whether it's parents or therapists or practitioners are like, but they're not doing yoga. And we really stand on the fact that if they come into class as a survivor of sexual violence who has had their body disrespected and their consent ignored, then them walking into that class and saying, today I would like to choose to do this with my body and have an adult respect it, is yoga. And it is exactly what we want them to be doing. And so we watch and we wait for them to decide to make a different choice. And oftentimes they do. But I think the first thing we do is listen to what survivors want and need, and then respect it and go from there and really trust that survivors know what they need to heal. We're just here kind of as like a conduit. Like we are the copper wiring, we just kind of, conduct the kind of what travels into that, like how does that healing happen? And so obviously we conduct the donations, right? Like we conduct the practitioners, we conduct the learnings. We're always, learning these things and evaluating and changing things based on what we feel like survivors are telling us. And that's kind of that's one way that we do work within kind of thinking about the body.
I love that, because I think what's very nuanced and tricky, because we're all in a toxic masculinity culture, is that when you push people, that's patriarchy, right? Like when you're pushing people, you're saying, I don't trust your process. Here's what you do. And by letting people lead their own healing. And I love this, because in my work with Truths with Food, it's all about rewriting your story. And it so mirrors what you're talking about. Like everyone's rewriting their story and embodying a new one is so different. Like there's not a formula for it. It's like the obstacle is the path, right? Like you got to you got to develop the self-trust to do that. But what you're saying is, we believe survivors are resilient and and can do this for themselves. We just have to create the space. And that's hard. That's a lot harder than it sounds, right? Because it's easier to push and say, no, you need to do these moves or this twists or, whatever the pose is.
Right. Well, and I think we can't fool ourselves into thinking that survivors haven't been doing this work on their own since the beginning of time.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Like there's no way that Black women could be who they were during the civil rights movement if they haven't been practicing their own healing traditions without the names that we give them now, right? Like there's no way that Native women could exist without practicing some form of healing after all of the trauma they endured. And so I think one of our problems that we have in this culture is we like to believe that like until science says it's like evidence-based, that it's not real, and that we need to, of course there's value in studying things. Of course there's value in evaluating things. We practice those things as well. But I think we practice it from the perspective of humility, noting that we are not creating something new here. Like providing space where people are safe and centered and loved and seen in and of itself is healing. And so, yes, do we provide therapy that is evidence-based? Absolutely. And do we, use best practices in terms of advocacy? Sure. But we also think about things like, what does it feel like to be in our space? Do we have snacks? Like, what is it? What happens when someone comes in? Like, how does it feel to be here? And some people would say that that's trauma-informed practices, but some of us, me, would just say that it's called being thoughtful and treating people with hospitality and treating them not as clients, but as community members that are a part of a collective. And that healing, like being someone who is healing and being someone who is a healer, is actually on the same plane. Like, I'm not here as a healed person. or as a healer, I'm someone who practices both healing and being a healer. And I think that sometimes we forget when it comes to people who have experienced trauma or even people who have mental health issues, that they can be the architects of their own healing path, and that we can come alongside them and support that, not from, them being in the valley and us being at the top of the mountain, but kind of us both being in different spaces all the time, that we're both kind of on that plane. And I think that's super important for all practitioners to recognize. I would have a serious problem with anyone who was like, well, I'm healed, so let me tell you the 6 things you need to do in order to get healed. We can't do that. It looks different for everybody.
And what you're doing there, again, you have been so intentional with the design, and as someone who's very intentional with the design of my programs to make sure that people feel like they're the expert and I'm just the guide on the side, I just so appreciate that, because what you're doing is collapsing the hierarchy of white supremacy and patriarchy and even capitalism, right? Because that idea that men are more valued than women, or that white people are more valued than non-white people, or that the rich are more valued in the ownership class are more valued than the workers, right? I mean, it's a complex hierarchy, but we believe in that, right? This is why we have experts and the healthcare is the way that it is. And even science, as you were talking about that, I'm totally, I love a good science study and like the rest of them. However, the deeper I get into this, the more I realize how science has its own biases here in the West, right? First of all, the body's broken because what I was hearing you say is that these survivors aren't broken. They don't need to be fixed. We just need to help them create a space where they can come back to wholeness. And I think because we're a victim blaming culture, so many of our systems build in this. It's not survivor led, whether it's sexual abuse or, I don't know, cancer, right? It's all like pharmaceutical led or whatever. But it's like, no, we know best up here, right? And science looks at the body as a liability, like something to, and that's what my whole master's thesis was on, like war on cancer, war on sexual abuse. It's like, okay, we're fighting the very problem that we've created.
Yeah. And also my body did exactly what it was supposed to do to protect me. Like, I think that's the other thing that we don't remember about what it means to have PTSD, right? The reason my body and my brain compartmentalized what happened to me was because my body and my brain physically could not handle it. And so in order for me to survive, my body had to do some things, had to tweak some things so that I could get through that period of time as whole as I am now. And now my process, and what I believe my process is really communicating to my body that it's okay to unfurl yourself, right? Like, you were not safe. So it makes sense to me that you have difficulty sleeping at night because nighttime is not a safe time for you. That makes sense to me that you would have that aversion, right? Like, and so there are little things in my body and in the way that I interact with the world that have been tweaked in an effort from my brain and my body to protect myself. And so shaming people for doing neurologically what their body is supposed to do through instinct and through fucking brilliance, actually, it's so wrong. It's the wrong way to look at it. Like, it's more like an invitation of, you are safe now. And what's hard about that is that no one knows more than someone who has experienced something traumatic. And I mean, it can be anything. It can be a shooting. It can be domestic violence. It can be a fire. It can be, being robbed. Like, no one knows more than someone who has experienced trauma that this world isn't safe, and that we cannot lie to ourselves that it is, but that we do have to live in it as if it is safe in order to feel a certain level of comfort. Like, so in all reality, survivors are the ones who know what the fuck is going on. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like, we know that shit ain't safe. And the world is trying to convince us that it is, and that we're wrong for being hypervigilant. We're like, no. Not only do we know it, but we experienced it. And so you don't need to lie to us. Yeah. My brain is not a fool. My brain is completely aware of what this world is like. And so there is a strange sort of like hierarchy that happens, and a sort of like, we know better because we can exist in this world feeling like things are safe. Well, good for you, but that's actually not the reality of the world that we live in. And so I find that, and that is a part of how, Western medicine or the medical industrial complex wants to convince us that we're wrong and they're right. When I think, most therapists will tell you that or anybody who understands how our brain functions in response to trauma will tell you that our bodies know exactly what the hell to do.
Yeah, I'm so glad. I'm laughing because when we first moved to Pittsburgh has like such a cancer history because of how the steel industry left things here, because corporations externalize their cost onto the public all the time. But
right.
we upgraded from like a Brita to this Berkey water filter, and it's not even expensive. I mean, it was an investment at first, but like in the long run, it's cheaper than all this other stuff. But Carlos was like, and I did it because I know, I was diagnosed with cancer here. I know the environment was a huge reason I got cancer. And so I get this Berkey water filter. I'm like, Carlos, I want to get this. And he's like, oh no. He's like, if we're starting down this path at like 36, he's like, I know where we're going to end up in like 30 years. And I was like, I can't help it. I know too much, it's so He's like, I sometimes think ignorance is bliss. I'm like, no, I do too. But like, once you pull back the curtain, you can't, you see that
you
there's
can't
a little man
it.
back there that wants dollar bills,
Yes. Yeah, no, there's no way to not know. And I think that in some ways is better. I always tell people that I would choose to know rather than to live in ignorance. At least then I can operate with some sense of knowledge. Excuse me, I'm like so burpy today. I don't know why, but only because we're recording right now. But like, I just would rather know. I feel like there's so much in this world that people intentionally keep from us, and we deserve that information in order to just live full lives,
Yeah, and so no one opens the trap door on you without knowing it.
Yes, I would like to see all the levers, please. Like, I want to see where the trapdoors are. Like,
yeah. Well, and then and then you have more contrast too. I love how you said with the Firecracker Foundation, it's about safety, and in this case, physical and emotional safety, because that was just so beautiful what you said. Then your body can unfurl, right, and do what it needs to complete to get returned to wholeness again and again and again. So I love that you're so mindful of that and you get it. Like, again, the design. I think for so many people listening, I think oftentimes I just want you to start paying attention to how things are delivered and how things are worded and fostered, because the design of something really informs whether someone's trusting you to be your own expert or if they're just trying to. And again, I think a lot of people are well-intentioned, but it doesn't develop self-trust to just be given formulas or, follow the 3 steps to mindfulness or whatnot. You have to find your own path, right? That's like the goal of healing. I mean, at least that's been my experience with myself and my clients.
I feel like if you never flex those muscles too, they atrophy. And I think for one of the things, when I think about, when I first started going to therapy and healing, I had to do a lot of reflection on choices that I was making that were based on what other people wanted me to do, because I didn't flex those muscles. I didn't think about my needs before anybody else. I was thinking about survival and what would happen if I made a choice that someone didn't approve of, because I spent so much of my life navigating, how my father was feeling and what might happen. Like what might happen if I did this one thing. Does that mean I'm going to get abused later? Or, you know what I mean? Like, children, humans in general who have been abused, like, are really good at playing like this kind of double dutch in their lives, where they're constantly, double dutch. You have a rhythm, right? So you're always like, I'm going in, I'm going out, I'm going in. You have to like kind of get the rhythm with the ropes before you decide when you're going to jump in. And we're like always navigating that and always kind of gauging the weather around us. And of course, this is not every survivor's experience, but I know so many survivors that feel that, like, practicing sitting with yourself and knowing what you need, which of course goes towards the work that you're doing with Insatiable, is about like, how do we know what we need to eat, to drink? Like, how do we know what it means to feel full? And I think for survivors, we spend so much of our time just trying to survive that we don't always know what is going to feel good in our bodies. And we don't get an opportunity to practice that. So when we're in a healing relationship with someone, whether it's a therapist or a yoga instructor, there needs to be that space where things are offered and we have a moment to think about like, wow, this posture feels really good. How long do I want to stay in it? Like, you know what I mean? Or or am I not ready for this posture? Does this posture feel really vulnerable and I don't like the way this feels? Maybe I can do it like this, And I think that healing can be approached in that same way, where survivors are offered an opportunity to really feel into what does it look like to say yes and what does it look like to say no, and can we survive saying no? And that's like a real question, because so many survivors are like, can I say no? What will happen? Like, is that a trapped door? If I say no, like, will people still love me? Will people still value me? Will they listen to me? If I have boundaries around where I end and another person begins. And I think that's very real.
Oh, yeah. And you said it in a very beautiful way. Am I allowed to say no? Is it safe to say no? And you know your stuff so much. I so appreciate you. I want to circle back, and then I know that we have to wrap up, but one of the things that you were mentioning about is like, does this feel good in my body? Does it not? And I think that's something that's tricky probably for survivors, is because a lot of survivors develop a lot of resilience, right? And that resilience and that pushing gets them a lot of stuff, not just surviving, but we live in a culture that rewards, pushing yourself beyond your limits. And so how have you relearned, as the executive director, the founder, a survivor, how have you had to see almost the shadow side of your resilience? And how would you have defined self-care in the beginning of starting the Firecracker Foundation? And where are you now, 5 years in, so that you can have deeper and deeper levels of healing?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think we have to talk about the time that I called you crying. Because I was like, I'm so tired. And it was just like, everything is falling apart. And it's not everything. No, it's just me. Everything else is being held together. But I am completely falling apart because it vacillates. Like, there are days when right now I'm feeling really good. I am really tracking my schedule so that if I work late, I don't work early. And being really aware of what I'm giving up. Like, what is that energy exchange that the foundation is getting from me versus my family versus myself? So like, I just started taking cello lessons.
Ooh.
I've always wanted to. Yeah, I've always wanted to my whole life. Not my whole life, probably since middle school, but we couldn't afford the rental. And now I understand why we couldn't afford the rental, because that shit is expensive between the lessons and the rental. But kind of as a gift to myself that's not work related. But yeah, I mean, I think it's hard. It's a hard line, because on the flip side of that, when I'm not doing as great as well as I'm doing right now in my self-care practice, I mean, I can work forever, and I have to really think about, first of all, I can work forever because I love my work. Like, I don't love that children are abused, but I love the healing that we do. I love that we are able to be in this position, and that I feel very privileged as a woman of color to be a founder of an organization that can offer these kinds of services. Like, that's remarkable to me. And I don't even understand how it came to be some days. Like, I don't even know. And then
I know, come on, you're gifted and you're hilarious. Follow her on Instagram, people, I'm telling you.
Yeah, definitely follow me on Instagram. And then the other side of that is like, I can work forever because that's in some ways where I learned to find value in myself. Because no one could argue, like, when people talk about like, how do you spot signs of child sexual abuse? I always get concerned for the overachievers, because people will tell you, oh, they won't get good grades, or they'll have an addiction, or they'll self-harm, or they're they're moody, which basically describes like most teens, right? Like so many teens have these very, like, okay, so you described humans.
From the ages of 13 to 18.
Right. Like, okay, well, got it. So that literally doesn't help parents to, figure that stuff out. But the other side of that is like, I was getting great grades. I was a cheerleader. I was very popular. I had lots of friends. Like I was someone who like would talk to everyone at my school. So I had like, there's always cliques, but I had like skater friends and drama club friends. And I was in choir, and like I just really moved through the world like very open, and also spent my time drinking in Mexico, right? So like I had a very full, complex, problematic youth, but also was dealing with a lot of trauma that was very internalized. So I couldn't talk about like those times when my friends were talking about sex and I had to pretend like I didn't know what they were talking about. Or I had to, when I first started dating and I didn't know did I even want someone touching me at all? Or is this just the normal thing to do because I'm a teenager? How are those signs going to show up for anybody? Like that's not... getting good grades is never on a chart that says, or overachieving, is never on a chart that says like how to spot child sexual abuse. You know what I mean? And so I think that I constantly have to have a conversation with myself around like, are you doing this because it needs to be done? Or are you doing this right now because you are surfing on both adrenaline and what it feels like to be valued by other people?
That's such a good question.
I have to ask it all the time because there is a part of me that proved my goodness after my father passed away by being good at things, by being seen, by being visibly active and involved in things that were important or that I felt like were important. And all of that can still be true. Like I still am that same person. Like I am still a person who wants to be about liberation and wants to be about good works in this world and during my lifetime. But I also am a person who deserves rest, right? Mm-hmm. And I deserve to learn how to play the cello really poorly. Like I am a person who deserves to garden and to like be a kitchen witch and make things and on a Sunday afternoon and not respond to all of the messages that I'm getting on a daily basis, which I don't know how anybody gets famous because I get so many messages every day and I don't even know how to live, like how to even respond to all of them. So it's like that is a very important question. And I think that when I'm thinking about, what I call militant self-care, I'm thinking about how I would like to do this work for as long as I want to do this work, and I won't be able to do it if I don't take care of myself.
I love when we connected though, because your doctor was like, wanted to put you on meds because you were having heart palpitations and all this stuff. And it was, again, I think it's that tricky line. I think your rebellious spirit, which was probably born from that outsider view, right, of being a survivor, was like, there's got to be a different way. And you've reversed a lot of health issues on your own, haven't you?
Yeah, no, I haven't. So my heart palpitations went away. And I'm just, yeah. And so what I'm really learning about myself, first of all, this is not new information. I've always known this about myself. I'm come on. I'm an all or nothing person. I think we talked about that too, right? Is like, this process is not all or nothing. It's a slow process. And so I've literally just been keeping notes in my journal of like my goals, and my goals are very simple. Like right now, I think my goal is to drink more water. And I think it's like drink more water than last week. Like, it's not even like 7 glasses a day or whatever the hell people say. It's literally like, okay, last week I had my water bottle with me all week. And I have a sense of how much tea, you know what I mean? Like how much water I'm actually getting in my body. And just being attentive to like, okay, well, drink more this week. And like, for me, it's a big deal if by the way, I'm still drinking smoothies every morning. That's
good. Yeah, and you learned to balance your blood sugar, which helped the palpitations.
Right. Yes. And not drink coffee for 12 hours a day. That also helps. Like, who needs a pill for that? I'm so upset with my doctor. Like, no one needs a pill to be told not to drink coffee all day. and then, making sure that I'm getting protein in the morning. But for me, like, again, my goals are very simple. Like, I want to make sure I eat. That's it. Yeah. Like, I want to eat every meal. And it doesn't have to be a big meal. Like, I know what I need in the morning. I've done better at lunch, but I'm not being hard on myself. I'm just like, no all or nothing. Just be all in and being attentive to like slowly improving and like making sure that your body is at least at minimum being getting nutrients, like at a basic level, like let's make sure you're actually getting food into your body. And from that, of course, based on the work that we've done together or that you shared with me, I'm definitely eating healthier things. But I think that another thing that survivors of trauma tend to be is extremists. Like we're very extreme when it comes to like how we think things are supposed to be, and we can be really hard on ourselves. So for me, just being like, no, you're just going to eat. Like, and until we feel confident that we're not going to not eat, we're going to keep that real simple. And then, in a couple of weeks, when I feel confident that I've prioritized eating for a good period of time, then I will decide that, okay, so I'm going to eat this kind of way. But right now, eating is the goal, and sleeping, going to bed at 10 o'clock versus at midnight, and not working all night. I definitely think that it's a process. I think that it's a careful process of, again, like listening to ourselves and really just unfurling, just being like, where can I take up space? Because that's the other thing, that not only as a woman, but as a Black woman, we don't think that we have the right to take up space. And I think that that's another thing that I have to approach with some wisdom around, like, yeah, I could take up space. Like, I should take up a lot of space.
Yes.
In my schedule and in my personal life and just in the way that I'm moving through the world, like I deserve space. And so I think that that's something that I've been really reflecting on too.
I love that. And I think what you're describing in Tashmica Took My Freedom from Cravings program is it's very gradual. And even with your sleep, working on that, I think that's also healing for survivors of any kind of trauma, to realize that you can go slow and steady and get results. That it doesn't have to be, again, I think the design of going slow and steady, which you're brilliantly doing. And I love how you're even using your own benchmarks, right? It's not like, I remember on like the Weight Watchers cards, like 8 glasses today. And you're like, wait a second, for me right now, the process itself can be healing if I just focus on more than last week, which is how it's done. I think that's brilliant. Trusting our own unfurling. I love that you gave us that concept. Thank you. So good.
You're welcome. Yeah, no, it's definitely not about somebody else's benchmark, because I mean, like sometimes too, I'm, like you said, I have a rebellious spirit. So if someone tells me I have to do something, I am definitely not going to do it. Yeah. But if I choose, but if I choose to do it, like that's actually why Weight Watchers and like any type of program that's like bossy pants is not going to work for me, because as soon as I feel that tension of being told that I have to do something a certain way, my whole body goes into a temper tantrum and is like, nope.
I'm that way too. A lot of my clients are, I think, I know from an adult learning perspective, adults hate their autonomy being taken away, like any adult. Yeah. But that's what we do to people, we infantilize them like all the time.
Yeah, and then they're like, track your food and tell me how many points. Like, who has time for that? Get out of here. I know. Nobody's doing that. Like, I can barely, if I am sitting here trying to convince myself just to eat 3 meals a day, I'm not telling you what I ate. Like, I don't have time for it. Not by points, right? Like, I can tell you I had a roast beef sandwich. That's all the information you're getting out of me.
Yeah. It has been so wonderful having you here, Tashmica. Is there anything that I didn't ask or that you think is important to share before we find out how we can support the Firecracker Foundation and follow you on Instagram?
Yeah. No, I think one thing that's really hard about this work, especially right now, and I feel it a lot for individual survivors, is just like trying to find safe space. Like I would just want to say that, like, if you are someone who is working through these issues and you are struggling with your partner or your community or your church, that there is safe space out there. It may take a little time and intentionality to find the humans that you need to surround yourself with. But I think you were right earlier, Ali, like 2018, really since 2016, we've really seen like a resurgence of kind of this victim blaming conversation. Not even resurgence. I mean, who are we kidding? It happens all the time. But I think what has become really clear in Lansing, in my community, is that we really do have to carve out a space for survivors to really be validated and seen, and for them to heal. And that's not just for children, that's for adults too. And I think that I would encourage people to just to try to find that space, because it is really valuable.
I love that. I love that. And trust your instincts, right? Because I think sometimes we don't, but trust your instincts if a space is safe or not, and do a little research ahead of time and make sure it's survivor led, which is why that's part of, I mean, there are many reasons I wanted to have you on, but I love that you have that survivors leading because you guys know best. So it's like, why don't we just take all the group wisdom, that hard-earned wisdom and experience, and put that to the greater good. So I love the work you're doing. Where can people find more about you? And I love the name, the Firecracker Foundation.
Yeah. So we're at thefirecrackerfoundation.org. That's where you can find information about us on our website, but we're also on Instagram at the Firecracker Foundation. And then on Twitter, we're Firecracker FDN. And then you can just follow me on Instagram at Tashmica. I'm one of those lucky human beings that not a lot of people have that name. And I have a Facebook page that's Tashmica Torok.
Wonderful. And we'll have all the links to find Tashmica in the show notes at alishapiro.com/podcast. Tashmica, thank you so much for being here. I hope we seize this collective moment and do something differently and take a look at, let the Firecracker Foundation take the lead so that we don't have to have this happen again in 30 years and say, what's happening here. So we will know definitely. And making progress. So thank you so much for being here and your work and rewriting your story.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed our conversation, Ali.
Great. Me too. I learned so much. Thank you, Health Rebels, for tuning in today. Have a reaction, question, or want the transcript from today's episode? Find me at alishapiro.com. I'd love if you leave a review on Apple Podcast and tell your friends and family about Insatiable. It helps us grow our community and share a new way of approaching health and our bodies. Thanks for engaging in a different kind of conversation. And remember, always, your body truths are unique, profound, real, and liberating.